We are here. Hey there, beautiful. How did you get so cute, huh? Huh? Do it again. She is.
Mama.
Hey.
We can start with that.
Okay, within my zone.
Stay in the box.
Stay in the box. Don't worry about
Just rock back and forth.
stepping on toes and feet. And then we listened to that
Joan
song
Osborne was like your jam.
for a while. Didn't last for long because then Alanis Morissette came out with Jagged Little Pill. Maybe the best.
Oh.
Question's always tricky.
Okay, what's
Do you
your
go genre
favorite?
specific or do you just from
Yeah, do genre.
Okay.
Love has surely shifted my way.
We have a phone book. We have a landline.
No!
Sweet dreams.
You stink! You stink!
Say you will. Say you will.
Em, I told you we were going to do the draft at Mike's house today.
I'm not talking to you.
You knew it was coming. I told you about the draft, did I not? Did I tell you about the draft?
You wear white and I wear out the words I love. And you're beautiful. That the wait is over. Love has finally shown.
Hello? No, I just finished dinner. Yeah, go over that all the time. Em, I'm sorry. I told you that. I told you.
It's just stuff I needed. I just put it on the credit cards.
The credit card, yeah, that adds up. Now, and the next thing you know, you're out spending this again. We
can pay
just
it off.
talked about
I'll
it.
just put it on the credit card.
It's been multiple times. It adds up. Can't you see this house, this dream house we live in? You're gonna run off? Go back to your mom. Spent the last 3 weekends there anyway.
Happy by my side. I promise to sing to you when all the music dies.
I'm tired. I'm so tired.
What are you tired of?
Aren't you
Look at me.
tired?
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I am sorry.
Just go.
Day and every day. If I ever get
Is it again?
say hello in the sky,
She is.
say you will. Say you will.
Hey.
Say you will. Say you will. Marry me.
A few years ago, the New York Times reported on a research study that tracked 1,700 couples that got married and stayed married over the course of 15 years. And the article reported that newlyweds enjoy a big happiness boost that lasts on average about 2 years. And then the special joy that they felt wears off, and they're back to where they started, at least in terms of happiness. Now, Christian author Gary Thomas illustrated these findings by using the image of an hourglass. He said, the moment you become smitten by someone, the second you find yourself deeply in love, is the moment that hourglass gets turned over. And there is enough sand in that hourglass, on average, to last you about 12 to 18 months. And on occasion, the sand may trickle down a bit beyond that, up to about 2 years, but never by much and not with the same intensity. The average lifespan of an infatuation is almost always less than 2 years. Now, the reality is, we didn't need a 15-year-old study to tell us that. We know that. Anybody that's ever been in a relationship can tell you that the glow of a new marriage fades pretty quick, and couples eventually settle down to the hard work of marriage. But what exactly is the hard work that we settle down to after the glow of the first couple of years wears off? I think Jeff Bridges said it best. In a recent interview, the Oscar-winning actor Jeff Bridges was asked to identify his worst character trait. Lean over to the person next to you and share your worst character trait. You don't want to do that, do you? No one wants to do that, which is why our worst character traits usually never come out until after a few years in marriage. Now, Bridges said this: what's my worst character trait? Not loving enough, not having enough compassion, empathy, wisdom. My wife and I have been married for 36 years. I'm deeply in love with her, but every once in a while, we'll get into what I like to refer as our deep, ancient battle. It's always very elusive, and it's hard to find the real kernel of it, but basically it's about this. You don't get it. You don't get what it is like to be me. Neither of us really understands what it's like to be that other person. Now, the fact is, after the glow wears off, each couple's marriage quickly settles down to about 2 or 3 areas of ongoing conflict that become issues over time for them. Every marriage develops what he calls its own deep, ancient battles. And those of us who are in marriages, we know exactly what he's talking about. Now, there are issues that keep coming up over and over time, but having these deep, ancient battles doesn't mean there's anything terrible about you as a person or about you as a couple. As long as people have been getting married, when two people come together with their own unique personalities, their own unique worldviews, their own unique families of origin, and their own private wounds, doubts, insecurities, and addictions, when those two people come together and the glow wears off, that masks the real issues lying subsurface in the relationship, eventually every marriage has to identify, stare down, and collectively work through their own unique, deep, ancient battles. Now, the reality is, every couple in this room falls into one of 3 categories. Let me just briefly touch on them, and what I want you to do is I want you to acknowledge, for those of you that are in a marriage, which group you're a part of. The first group happens to be those who are headed for divorce. You're married and you know it's just a matter of time. You know you're waiting till you have enough money, or you're waiting for a certain point in the future. You're married and you're just putting in time. In fact, some of you that are brand new today, you may be in this very situation, and you're like, you know what? It's a whole lot cheaper to go to church than marriage counseling. And you are in the right place. And hopefully you'll come and be a part of this series, but more importantly, plug into this community that will get you set straight. The reality is, many of us in this room were in this first group at one point in time. The second group, however, looks an awful lot like a happy, healthy marriage, but it's not. And it's those that are resigned to simply cohabitate together. Many of the happy-looking marriages in this room are actually in the second group. Yes, you raise the kids. Yes, you have sex, and you enjoy one another's company from time to time, but you have exchanged intimacy for functionality. There are issues, the deep ancient battles that you have, that you just avoid for the sake of convenience. So you cohabitate together, you live together, and many of you have marriages that have been like this for years. There are elephants in the room that you have just grown accustomed to avoiding. Your marriages remind you of that great line from the Eagles song, we're all just prisoners here of our own device. And the things that keep you in the relationship are strong enough to keep you together. Kids, money, convenience. But the issues aren't strong enough to tear you apart, so you just cohabitate. Now, we did a survey this past week where we asked people in the congregation to fill out questions about marriage, and more people responded to this survey than any other survey we've ever done in the history of our church, which is interesting. Now, we asked this question, and we're going to be sharing this over the next 2 weeks, but one question we asked was, obviously you love your kids, you have great moments with your spouse, but if you could do it all over again, would you marry your spouse? What do you think the response was? What percentage do you think said, yes, I'd marry my spouse all over again? What percentage do you think said, absolutely no way? Take a look. That's the response. Now, there's one thing that we know, demographers know, and particularly our experience here at our church, it's this. Christians lie. And that's because, honestly, you think we're going to capture your IP address. We're going to find out who it is. Who is that? All right, we're going to look it up. And that's certainly not the true. That's never the case with these surveys. So undoubtedly, the no response is much, much larger than it actually is. But for 1 out of 10 couples in the room to say, honestly, I would never do this again with this person. That's telling. So let me just pause here for a moment and ask you, do one of these first two groups categorize your marriage? Are there issues that are destroying your marriage and it's just time before you quit? Or do you just ignore the issues and you've chosen rather to coexist for certain reasons? The good news is there's a third group in this room. And it's those who are addressing their deep ancient battles with kindness. These people started out with just as many issues as the first two groups, just as many disadvantages, just as many feelings of, I married the wrong person, what in the world have I done? It was a huge mistake. Just as many thoughts like that. Couples that started out just like the other two groups, but unlike the other two, they understand the passage that we're going to look at right now. They understand the heart of this passage, whether even they know this passage exists. The passage that we're going to look at is a must-get passage to move from the first two groups to the third group. And so if you're in a marriage and you want to make that happen, you want to be a part of a healthy, growing marriage, you need to get this passage. And even if you're not married, you need to get this as a Christ follower, whether or not you want to get married in the future or not. Look at this passage. Galatians chapter 5, verse 13 begins. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. For the entire law, the entire Old Testament, is fulfilled in keeping one command. Love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. Now, in that passage, I see three words that pop right out at us. And the first is freedom. When we get married, there's no marriage police, right? You have the freedom to decide how you're going to be in your marriage, how you're going to relate to one another, how you're going to conduct yourselves. There's no one watching your marriage. Like right in the middle of an argument, that person jumps in and says, now, how can we rephrase that in a way that's a win-win, right? No one's going to do that, right? You have the freedom to do whatever you want to do in your marriage relationship. But unfortunately, there's a second word that pops out, and it's that word flesh. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Now, that word flesh comes from the Greek word sarkos, and in the old NIV translation, it was translated the sinful nature. In other words, it's the base part of us from which emanates our sinful desires and our sinful reactions towards people. When you give full expression to the flesh, Paul's saying, when you let it go, when you're unrestrained, when you give no thought to your Christian values or your Christian walk or how it's going to make the other person feel, when you just let it go and indulge the flesh, that's what Paul's saying you need to avoid, because when you do that consistently, bad things start to happen. Paul is saying that now that you're married as adults, you can do whatever you want within the constraints of the law in your marriage. But please don't indulge the flesh. Well, Paul says that he's talking about yelling, constantly critiquing one another, belittling one another, embarrassing one another, bringing up the past, hitting below the belt. We all know that. I mean, I don't, because I've never done those things, but you do. Obviously do. Now, years ago, a situation happened where another pastor in another church did something really terrible to me. And I had every right to come unglued on him, which I did. I just went nuts on the guy. Now, afterwards, I felt really bad, and I was talking with a mentor of mine, and I was sharing what happened and how I responded, and I said, how would you have handled that? And he leaned back and he said, you know, you had every right to respond that way. No one would argue with how you handled that, but he said, my wife and I, we have this word that we use in our marriage that whenever we vent, whenever we indulge the flesh, whenever we respond in a way that's not Christ-like, we have this word that we use and we call it unbecoming. And so when I act that way, she will say, that's so unbecoming of you. When she does something, I will say, that is so unbecoming. You are a 30-year-old person. You're not a child. And the way that you just responded is so unbecoming. And see, the question isn't whether or not your marriage has its deep, ancient battle. It does. It will have a few of them. The question is, have you committed that you will not address your spouse in a way that is unbecoming of a person that's in a marriage, and that is an adult? I recently heard about a man and woman that were in a car crash. Both of their cars were completely totaled. And as they crawled out of each of their cars, they looked at one another, and their glances caught one another, and they were immediately hit by the fact that, oh my gosh, we're alive, and we're meant to be. And she hugged him, and he hugged her, and they embraced, and they held it just a little bit longer than just friends would. And they realized that there was something special and magical about this moment, that they were brought together for a reason. And she looked at him and said, do you know what I'm thinking? He said, yeah, I know what you're thinking, but we were brought together for a reason. And she said, and look, let's celebrate this new relationship. Look in the back of my car, there's a full bottle of wine, completely unbroken. It's a miracle. And she grabbed it, pulled the cork out, and handed it to him and said, let's celebrate. Well, he looked at her and just chugged it, and then handed it back to her and said, here, it's your turn. And she took the cork, put it back in the bottle, put it in the car. And he was like, what are you doing? And she said, I'll wait till the police get here to celebrate. And now, how couples get together never cease to baffle any of us. Those of us who are married, we all have stories about the unique way we met and where we were and what time it was and what we felt and what he was wearing and she was wearing and how it all happened and that sort of thing. Every marriage has its own unique story of how their love started. Unfortunately, every love story that grows cold ends in virtually the same way. Psychologist Cliff Notorious of the Catholic University of America and Howard Markham of the University of Denver discovered that none of the factors that one would guess might predict a couple's durability actually does. Not how in love a newlywed couple say they are, not how much affection they exchange, not how much they fight or what they fight about. In fact, the researchers said that couples who endure and those who don't look remarkably similar in the early days. Yet when Notorious and Markham studied newlyweds over the first decade of their marriage, they found a subtle but telling difference at the beginning of their relationships. Among couples who would ultimately stay together, on average, 5 out of every 100 comments made about each other were put down. 5 out of every 100. Among the couples who would later divorce, roughly 10 out of every 100 comments were insults. That gap magnified over the following decade until couples were flinging 5 times as many cruel and invalidating comments at each other as happy couples. And the researchers commented, hostile put-downs act as cancerous cells that, if unchecked, erode the relationship over time, and in the end, relentless, unremitting negativity takes control, and the couple can't get through a week without major blow-ups. And this is essentially what Paul is saying in this passage. He says, you, my brothers and sisters, we're called to be free. There's no marriage police watching over you. Every single move that you make and words that you share. But don't use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. In fact, the entire Bible is summed up in one command. Just love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour each other, watch out or you will be destroyed by each other. And that's the third word that I want to point out, destroyed. Destroyed means to, in the original Greek, to completely empty something. Like a big jug where you poke a hole in the bottom and it just drains it out from the bottom. Or taking a bank account and over time completely draining it of the funds. If you constantly nitpick and bite and argue, eventually there will be nothing left and you will have gutted your marriage of all substance. And so let me ask you, are you willing to do that? Are you willing to serve your spouse in love? Are you willing today to say, regardless of what has happened, regardless of the bad decisions, regardless of the litany of reasons I have to treat him or her poorly, regardless of all of that, I am going to serve my spouse humbly in love. You see, the third group, the ones who have the healthy marriages, it's not because they don't have issues. It's the way they work on the issues that defines the relationship. They are committed to one another in love to be kind to one another. Now, the church that I grew up as a kid, we had a number of Sunday school classes, but the Sunday school class of the really old geezers, that I always loved these people. Loved them. They were so gracious to the teenage students that wreaked havoc in the church, right? There was this Sunday school class they called the Bicota class. And I'd always thought it was an odd name until I asked my dad, what does Bicota mean? I thought it was some weird Greek Bible word or something. He said, Bicota, from the King James Version, be ye kind one to another. I said, that certainly describes the people that were in that group. They were just kind people. Abraham Herschel said, when I was young, I used to be mesmerized by skill and talent and prestige. But the older I've gotten, the more I've been impressed by kindness. And kindness is something that is all throughout the Bible. Ephesians 4, 1 through 2, the Apostle Paul says, I urge you to live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. The great passage, the love passage, 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient. Love is... In the survey this week, we asked, What's the number one thing you and your spouse argue about? Before I show it here, what's the number one thing? What do you think the number one thing is that couples in our church fight about? We give them use of time, days off, issues with the kids, division of household duties, money, sex, faith, church issues. What do you think it is? Here's the response. Take a look. Number one, money. Number two, interesting enough, division of household duties. My experience is that the men in this room are not pulling their weight on the division of household responsibilities. Agree? Or not? Oh, I'll get to you women, trust me. Trust me. Oh, it's coming, right? How many of you, can you put it back up here? How many of you, sex is like the major issue? Go ahead and raise your hand, right? No one's going to do that, right? Issues with kids. I wanted to show this for two reasons. Number one, we're hauling it together. We all wrestle with the same stuff. See, I remember in the early years of our marriage, when we were going through such a difficult time, I felt so alone, like, oh my gosh, we're the only Christians that are having problems in our relationship. We're the only, no. We're all wrestling about the same stuff. But the thing that defines the third group is how they go about addressing their issues. And so I want to ask you, are you willing to leave here committed to working through your deep, ancient battles with kindness? As Tim Keller wrote, over the years, you will go through seasons in which you have to learn to love a person you didn't marry, who is something of a stranger. You will have to make changes that you don't want to make, and so will your spouse. The journey may eventually take you into a strong, tender, joyful marriage, but it is not because you married the perfectly compatible person. That person doesn't exist.